Hi everybody. So today I wanted to talk about, I think, a very important topic, which is the topic of genetics and its relationship with hard work. Today I'm specifically going to talk about how this applies to fitness, but it does apply to a lot of other things as well. I just simply don't have the time to talk about it today. Maybe that is material for another video. So, as always, before we get started, do not hesitate to smash that like button to bless yourself and all the Himbos around the world with a 5x multiplier to their gains. Also, don't forget that if you are interested, I do offer affordable online coaching services, and you can apply via the link below. So this is a topic that I see discussed a lot on the internet, but at the same time, I feel like I don't see a lot of actually very nuanced takes, which is to say that very often, people are just sort of arguing from the gut, they're arguing from their emotion and how they feel about it. And very often people tend to fall very strongly into one camp or the other. There are people who are saying, oh no, it's all genetics, or there are people who are saying, oh, it's all hard work. And, there's not really a ton of people, I would say, in the middle who are saying, yeah, they're both valuable, maybe one is a little bit more valuable than the other, whatever the case is, but of course you need both. Hilariously, I do tend to see also that a lot of the people who fall into either camp, they tend to sort of focus on the bias that suits kind of their worldview or sort of how they understand things. So for example, when you take someone who is incredibly jacked, who looks great, who is therefore by definition someone with great genetics, they'll say, oh, it's all hard work. I just work hard, I work out all the time, and that's what it is. It's nothing else. Just the hard work, not the genetics, even though, of course, the fact that they have the results that they have is proof that by definition they must have had good genetics. Then meanwhile you see these people who, they work out hard, they don't really see much in the way of results because maybe they don't know what they're doing or whatever the case is, maybe they're training way too hard, whatever the case. Either way, they tend to be the kinds of people who they don't see really much gains. It hasn't really clicked for them in terms of really understanding how to make long-term progress. And so they say, oh, you know what, it must just be all genetics. It's all genetics, that's all it is. It's, that's what those other guys are succeeding from. It can't possibly be, the fact that I don't really know everything yet. So which is it really? Well, I would like to refer back to an excellent post from Greg Nuckols a while back, which is entitled, Just How Different Are We? And it's about the topic of just how different are we genetically? What is the range of responses that people can get from exercise? And it's important to understand that when we're talking about genetics, what we colloquially call genetics, that doesn't just mean genes, because there are so many other factors that go into it. There are things like epigenetics, which is basically just kind of how our genes are turned on or off based on our environment, basically how our genes are activated and used. There are factors like your development in utero, which can then impact your entire lifespan simply because of the way you were born and the kinds of stimuli that you had while you were in the womb. So at the end of the day, basically, before training, about half of your body mass, muscle mass, can be explained away simply by genetics, which is to say that about half of that difference between you and any other person is going to be from genetics. However, we've done research basically just to say, okay, how different is the range of responses that people get? So for example, in one study, people basically put a crap ton of exercisers on a program to train their biceps, and then they just kind of recorded, okay, what is the range of responses? What are we seeing in terms of the high end and the low end in terms of responders? The range was basically massive. When they were talking about muscle size, people ranged from basically seeing no difference at all from training to having a 60% increase in their bicep size. Imagine, just me sitting here right now and my biceps just grew 60% over, the course of a few months of training. That is a pretty significant difference between those high responders and those low responders. And the results were even more different when it came to training for strength. So for strength, some people saw, again, basically no response despite their training, and some people saw as high as a 250% increase in their strength, which is, again, a massive, massive difference between the highest and the lowest end of the spectrum when it comes to genetics. So you can imagine that there are some people who will train, they will work very hard, they will see, maybe just a few percentage points, not very much, just, really nothing. And then legitimately on the other end of the spectrum, there are people who are just going to blow up with very little training, and that's just because they have the right genetic responsiveness to training. They can do basically anything and get better results than anybody else because they simply have the right genetics for it. So it is certainly true that there are some people who just respond less and some people who respond more, and there's a pretty significant difference. There's a pretty wide range. There's a lot of potential responses. You would typically expect that you're going to fall somewhere in the middle, but there are truly high and low responders. Another interesting note is that aside from things like chronic illness, genetic issues that really do hamper your ability to train and to adapt, it's very unlikely that there are serious non-responders, which is to say people who just see no results at all whatsoever from training. So there have been studies that have been basically aimed at this exact topic to see, hey, okay, do we have actual non-responders, people who don't get any response at all out of training? So one study, basically what they did was they gave people a few different training frequencies. So they ranged from, basically just 1 day a week to, 5 days a week. And then they took all of the people who didn't respond to that segment of training, and they basically just bumped them up a day. They made them train more. And then all of the people who didn't respond in that second round, again, they bumped them up again, and they kept doing this process until they had no non-responders left. Which is to say that at the end of the day, there basically weren't any non-responders at all that they could find. There were just people who hadn't been training enough to elicit responses. There have also been studies that have basically taken people and put them on basically just one kind of standard workout program versus programs that are a bit more tailored to the individual, that are obviously a little bit more self-directed, that give them a bit more freedom, that are not so strict. And they tended to find that just basically some people respond differently to different kinds of training. There are some people who are going to respond better to a certain kind of program than a different kind of program. And so very often when we talk about what someone thinks they are a non-responder, what the reality is probably not that they really just have something wrong with their body where they can't adapt to exercise. What's a lot more likely is simply that they haven't found the approach that works for them, or they are not training hard enough to actually elicit further adaptations. So of course, there's no one-size-fits-all program. There's no one-size-fits-all approach for everybody. And if you're finding that you're not really seeing results, it's very possible that you're a low responder. But at the end of the day, I've worked with so many low responders as a coach over the years, and I've seen plenty of low responders who basically, yes, they had very, very slow progress, but they stuck with it, they continued to train, and they saw incredibly serious results over, a long period of time, years at a time, versus people who, for example, reacted more strongly initially, but then they get frustrated when the going gets slower, and then they basically just stop training altogether, and they, of course, then stop seeing results. So at the end of the day, a low responder can sometimes outpace a higher responder, so long as, of course, they are more diligent, they are more obviously consistent and careful with their training. So, of course, the next question that's going to come up for a lot of folks is, how can I tell? How do I know if I'm a higher or a lower responder? How do I know? And the answer to this is simply, we don't have any way of figuring that out. The science has not adapted or progressed to the point where we can really understand every single factor that is going to go into training success. We can kind of only do it from the other end, which is to say, we put a bunch of people in a program and we see who responds best and who doesn't. We don't really have a way of then, saying, for example, like, I'm going to administer this blood test and it's going to tell me in advance that you're going to be a great athlete. So at the end of the day, really all you can do is try it out. You can try it out, train hard for a few years, follow a good program, and if it works out that it turns out that you've got great genetics and you respond very strongly, then of course you're going to want to stick with it. If it turns out that you're not really seeing serious results, despite following a pretty well-structured program, then chances are that you're not ever going to be the next Arnold Schwarzenegger, but that doesn't mean that you can't continue to progress and improve over time so long as you stick with it. And that's an important topic. We're going to come back to that in a minute. So I've talked about the impact of genetics. Everything I've said so far might make you think, hey, I guess it's all genetics, that's it. It has, 0%, due to hard work. Well, that's not really the case either, because at the end of the day, what we're measuring when we're talking about higher or lower responders is we are not talking about people who are just naturally jacked, because basically nobody is naturally jacked. There are things that can, sort of naturally make people a bit stronger in terms of, okay, they've got more height, they've got more base muscle mass, etc. But there's basically nobody who just wakes up as a kid and is just, jacked. That doesn't happen. People get jacked by training, and then those people who have good genetic adaptability, which is to say they respond better to training, are going to then progress faster and further. They're going to adapt more strongly, and they're going to get further as a result. So what you're doing is you're putting in that stimulus, and the people who have good genetics are the people who respond best to that stimulus. And what that means is that basically everybody is putting in the hard work. When you're following a training program and you're following it consistently, that's putting in the hard work. And so long as you're putting in that hard work, basically everybody is doing that. But the problem is that genetically, some people are simply going to adapt more strongly than others. They're going to benefit more from the same amount of work, and that means that they are going to be able to accomplish more. They're going to get stronger. They're going to build more muscle mass. They're going to perform better, and so on. And that is just because of their genetics. So at the end of the day, it's not that, people who have good genetics just, get results without any work. Of course, they're working, but it's that the work that they put in is just, they're getting a lot more rewarded for it than somebody who is, for example, putting in a lot of hard work, doesn't have as great of genetics, and is as a result just seeing sort of, just very slow gains, or just kind of, not world-class, physique or strength, for example. Now, another question is, what about the obvious elephant in the room, which is steroids? And obviously, steroids are another huge key piece of the picture that basically, people don't like to talk about. It's something where, of course, steroids have a potential negative side effects on your health. Steroids are illegal, and at the same time, steroids are going to be a huge benefit in terms of your performance. They help a lot more for muscle mass than for strength, but people are still going to take steroids if they are looking to perform at their best because they want to be a serious athlete. And because steroids are illegal, because there's that taboo, they're going to have that incentive to lie about it. And so long as they're lying about it, then it's kind of silly when, it's like, they could say, it's genetics, they could say, it's hard work. The reality is that steroids are certainly doing a lot of it as well. And it's the same thing, taking steroids is not going to diminish the fact that you're doing hard work. It is just going to be another factor that increases the results that you get from, the same amount of work compared to everyone else. Everyone's putting in the hard work. You're just going to adapt more strongly. Sadly, of course, this just confuses the picture. It just makes it harder to have, again, sort of open, honest discussions about this sort of thing. And it sort of reduces the level of nuance, again, that you see in the community because, again, people are always arguing. And so sometimes there is that third option where people say that it's all steroids, has nothing to do with genetics or hard work either. It's just the steroids. But again, it's not just the steroids. When you look at somebody who is a world-class athlete, chances are that it is a combination of all three. It is not just any single one factor that is going to be, basically the only thing that makes them successful. So the next question, of course, is what can I do about this? What can you reasonably do about this information that I have given you in this video? So interestingly, we also have a lot of research on the topic of mental belief and how it impacts people's performance and adaptation to training. One study basically told people that they were going to be given steroids, and then instead they simply gave them a placebo. And what ended up happening was that these folks who were training very hard saw almost steroid-like results from their training, despite the fact that they weren't actually receiving a steroid simply because of the placebo effect. And so that tells us that, to a certain extent, there are sort of mental limitations that can be affecting just basically what results you get out of fitness. Those expectations created stronger adaptations for those folks, despite the fact they weren't actually taking steroids. In another study, folks were tested to see if they had a very specific gene linked to performance in a very specific area. They then, of course, told those folks that they had or didn't have the gene, so they had either the good version or the bad version, but they split folks into 4 groups. So they said, some people have the good gene and they were told they have the good gene. Some people have the bad gene and they were told they have the bad gene. But then in the middle, they had some people who had the bad gene but were told they had the good gene, and vice versa. Some people who had whatever the opposite of that was. I just entirely forgot while I was saying it. Anyway, the point is that then at the end of the study, they looked at those groups in the middle who had been, told the wrong thing. And what they found was that the people who had the bad gene but had been told they had the good gene performed a lot better than the other folks who had been told that they had the bad gene when they did. And then the people who had the good gene but had been told that they had the bad gene did worse than the people who had the good gene but told that they had. And so the end result was that we can pretty clearly see that those expectations about our genetics can have an incredible impact on basically just what kind of results we get. If we have this prejudice in advance that we don't have good genes or that we have good genes, that is going to color the way that we train. It's going to impact our motivation. It is going to change the way that we do things. And that is going to result in us having completely different outcomes. This isn't to say that basically we have, unlimited adaptable power in ourselves. It's not to say that you can simply, take all the placebos in the world and convince yourself that you're going to be the most jacked person in the universe and succeed. There are limits to that, certainly. But it does tell us a lot about the extent that knowing about our genetics can actually influence or change our behavior in the future and can influence or change the results that we get from our training. So instead of worrying about those external factors like, okay, what can my genetics possibly be? What's that guy over there lifting? What does that guy look like? You should instead just be focusing on ignoring all that stuff out there and trying to be better than you currently are. Because realistically, not everybody can be a world record holding powerlifter, for example, but virtually everybody could be stronger. Everybody could make some kind of improvement in their life if they trained and they committed to it and they didn't let themselves get discouraged by all these kinds of external stimuli that they experience. At the end of the day, hard work is, not the entire part of the equation, but hard work is the part of the equation that you have the most control over. It is the one thing that you can change. And when you focus on the things that you can change and you just ignore or, sort of push to the side the things that you can't change, then typically you're going to see a lot better results than if you are constantly fretting and worrying about the things that you can't control. Like I mentioned before, I've had a lot of clients over the years. I've experienced a lot of clients who simply, didn't have great genetics, but they stuck it out. I had a woman who for the longest time worked with me, and it was basically, it was like snail's pace. Like every single workout, every single week we would say, okay, just add like one more rep this week. See if you can do one more rep. And, every week, like clockwork, she could just barely do one more rep, and this would just kind of keep happening. And, over time it added up and she got, incredibly stronger. It took her a long period of time to progress, but because she stuck with it, she saw really awesome results versus, for example, I get clients who start off, they, work with me for a few months. They kind of hit that wall where, okay, maybe their progress slows a little bit because that's a natural part of the process. And then they just end up kind of getting discouraged and quitting and moving on. And of course, just deciding that, maybe this isn't for them. At the end of the day, again, while genetics do have a huge impact, and genetics are going to be the big determining factor when you're talking about things like the Olympics or setting world records or, like who is going to be the most impressive athlete. At the end of the day, most of us fall somewhere in the middle. Most of us are not going to be on either end of those extremes. And most of us can get better, most of us can put in more effort, and most of us, by putting in the hard work, will get better results. So that is all for today. As always, if you liked the video, don't hesitate to smash that like button, subscribe, tell me what you want to see in future videos, and I will see you all next week. Have a good one.